Tonight we have Lynn Arave to teach us and talk to us. Lynn graduated from Roy High School and earned degrees in journalism and human performance from Weber State University, and also ran cross country and track for the Wildcats. He was sports editor of the Weber State Signpost for 2.5 years, and also reported on high school sports for the Ogden Standard Examiner and the Associated Press during his college years. He worked as a reporter editor for the Deseret News for more than 31 years, retiring at the end of 2010. He began as a sports writer, but eventually became one of the newspaper's most versatile writers and covered about every beat except crime and courts. He had a weekly column on Utah radio stations for more than 26 years, and also reported on the outdoors, history, and the LDS Church for about 20 years. He also wrote hundreds of advance obituaries for many Utah VIPs and general authorities over the years. He has written 6 books, 3 are in print and 3 are online. Today he works part-time for Layton City Administration as a news specialist. He also has a monthly history column in the Deseret News. He has 12 blogs, including his most popular one, The Mystery of Utah History, and he lives in Layton. So I turn the time over to Lynn.
Just gonna pick me up, or do we need to raise
Lynn,
it?
do you want to get the mic for it?
What?
Oh, just raise it or?
Bring it a little closer. I hear it. It's on.
Okay. So anyway, here's something I did a few years ago on Salt Lake Mountains. If you ever wonder what the names were or whatever, they took a picture of Salt Lake Airport number 2 and then spliced it all together. And then added the names of the canyons and all the peaks that there are. Some aren't officially named, so that's the best I could do at the time. So let me start off with kind of the devil of the subject, Devil's Gate in Weber Canyon. That caught my attention years ago because I kept hearing stories from my grandmother about this weird area she had to go through the canyon. It was called Scrambled Egg Curve and all these various names, but originally it was Devil's Gate, and the pioneers would have preferred to have come through Weber Canyon instead of immigration, but the advanced scouts saw what a tough ordeal that would have been to go through the river, and they had the diaries of some previous parties, so they backtracked and said, no, you're going to have to go through, we're going to have to go a different way because we can't get through Devil's Gate. But even after the pioneers, that became a really tough way to get through there, and it used to be called Scrambled Egg Curve, and before the freeway, it was really quite a place where trucks would lose their load because you'd have to literally do a big loop around the river to get through there. So it was only in the mid-60s when they built the freeway that they dynamited the mountain away there, and you just went through there at 70 miles an hour now, but you didn't back then. But kind of interesting, I guess, what if the pioneers would have got through, they probably just would have headed towards Salt Lake anyway. And maybe South Weber would have been more famous because that's where they came into the valley, but I don't think they would have stayed there. And further up the canyon, they have Devil's Slide, and I didn't realize that back in the early 1900s, some groups actually slid down that slide. Some of these Shriners groups would every summer go into there and actually somehow slide down that thing, that slide of rock, which looked pretty wicked to me, how sharp it was. But I thought Devil's Slide was unique, but if you go north of Yellowstone towards the freeway in Livingston, there's actually another Devil's Slide. This one has kind of a curve to it, unlike the one in Weber Canyon that's straight. And then I always grew up thinking this is the place monument was the original place where Brigham Young said, this is the place, drive on, but some years ago I realized there's an earlier monument up the hill there. I don't know, how many of you have seen that white monument that's up the hill there? I mean, I guess they made that one in 1921. It's only 8 or 10 feet high, but they figured that's closer to where he probably really stood there and, said this is the place. And then it was 1947 on the 100th anniversary when they added the full-blown monument we have there today. So you just never know sometimes about history. Then, Lagoon's east of the freeway now, but back in its first 9 or 10 years, it was out west by the lake, just like Saltaire was and all the lakeside resorts. I think there were 8 lakeside resorts in the day. And it's kind of confusing because they all like to use the word lake. So there was Lakeside and there was Lake Park, and I think Lagoon was originally called Lake Park. They were out there for the first 8 or 9, I think it was 9 years, 9 seasons, out there right by the lake west of Farmington. And then the lake started to recede. And by then, Simon Bangerter just thought, well, this isn't working, so he's the one that got it and moved everything he could, inland. And you go to Lagoon today and they just have that one lake. Apparently it was originally 2 smaller lakes and they kind of dredged between them and combined them to make the one lake. And that kind of became its namesake, Lagoon. But I went out to the old Lagoon location, I think it was last spring. You can't find a thing. There's absolutely nothing unless I guess you dig for it. Nothing you can see, anything. It's just kind of a horse preserve and all wetlands, and the lakes, shrunk so much that you can look way in the distance to even see the lake there. But speaking of Lagoon, I got curious growing up too about, you'd always hear these stories about accidents of Lagoon, somebody got killed, or the wild mouse jumped the tracks or whatever. So now that a lot of newspapers are searchable on the computer by keywords, so I started looking, and I think to date I found about 20 different deaths at Lagoon over the years. Most of them, for any one commonality, were the wooden roller coaster. 4 people have been killed on that. One was a worker who got too close to the car when it was coming by. The other 3 were all people that wanted to stand up in their seat and fell out. And one of them fell out as early as, I think it was 1989, was the most recent one. And after that accident, Lagoon pushed the seats a little forward in those cars so that you couldn't stand up so easy. But the young people always like to get what they call air, so they just kind of raise off their seat a little. And that's what basically killed those 3 people, was they were trying to get air, and then there were no seat belts, and so they just flew out. Long drop to the bottom. There were, just a few other accidents, but as far as I can tell, the rumors of the wild mouse jumping the tracks, that never happened. I found evidence of a collision in the 60s in the original. See, the wild mouse ride they have now, that's the one that does those sharp turns. It was a wooden one. I think it had a crash where 2 cars kind of crashed into each other near the start of it and kind of caused some neck injuries. I think that's the source of the accidents, but the modern ones all steel and as safe as they can be. And then most of the other deaths were caught in swimming accidents. Too many people, diving in shallow water, too deep, or just drowning, kind of things over the years. But still, statistically, you're a lot more dangerous to drive to Lagoon on the freeway than it is to do anything there. Like probably a 5 million to 1 you'll get hurt at Lagoon, but it's probably what, in the 100,000 or less driving, if not more than that. And then I grew up in West Weber County, out in Hooper, Roy area, and you looked west there and you saw Fremont Island. So Fremont Island always kind of mystified me, how there could be an island out there. And so finally they built a causeway to Antelope Island, then you could look over closer to Fremont Island. So finally I got permission. I went out to Fremont in the early 80s. I canoed out there with some friends, and we walked around the island, and there were exotic sheep on the island then, huge horns. They still had wild Shetland ponies out there in the mid-80s where they rounded them up. When I was on the top point of Fremont looking out west, see, from the end here, Fremont looks just like a long sliver, but it really has a big piece that goes out west you can't see. In fact, there's an airport landing strip out there. As soon as those Shetland ponies heard or saw me, they just took off as far as they could go on that western end. And then they rounded them all up in the late 80s. But the Richards family, who owns Granite Furniture, they bought Fremont Island back in, I think, the 50s or 60s, and hoped it would be a resort like Antelope Island's become, and it just never took place. And they even tried to get the state to make an Alcatraz out there, and that didn't work. Because remember, there was that grave robber back in the 1860s that got banished out there and then disappeared, so it kind of had a legacy of a prison anyway. But Fremont, like most of the islands down the lake, they're not islands, they're connected to the mainland, in fact. And the first time in 2004 and the second in 2008, the lake receded so much that I walked out to Fremont Island from the causeway to Antelope. Didn't even get wet at all, just absolutely dry. Got some pictures in this little book. I had passed this around, I guess, and some of you can look at this. I think there's some pictures in there that show some of the boys that I took pictures of, where it's probably a little higher than this flag. With my son standing next to it with his hiking pole, and he's trying to show how deep the lake was back in the mid-80s, or during the year of the Great Salt Lake pumps and all that, the record highs. So it's lost a lot of water out there in the lake. Then I think the deepest point in the Great Salt Lake was only like 35 or 36 feet in the heyday anyway, so it was never that deep. And there's a famous cross out there that Kit Carson carved on Fremont Island, and I think I've been out there twice to see it now, but it's one of those things that I always miss it, because you think it's some huge thing, but it's like this big. It's like 6 inches long. I mean, it's not that big, but it's, the sun hits it, it's a really prominent place there. But Kit Carson was so bored when he was out there with John C. Fremont doing a government survey that he just was bored and carved that cross there, because he had recently got into Catholicism and wanted to kind of show his faith, I guess, anyway, and leave the cross there. But then a family lived out there, Fremont Island in the, I think, 1890s. And the ruins of their house are still out there, and their graves are still out there, of the father and mother. But in recent decades, Fremont Island is just farmed out to ranchers. There were cows out there when I was out there last in 2008. There was horses. Like I say, 10 years before, there were sheep out there, and so it's kind of a stock island out there, and just a lot more pristine than Antelope Island. I mean, you just don't meet people out there, but it's privately owned, so you have to get permission to do there. And since I started walking out there, the state's now made it illegal to walk on that sandbar. The first time I did it, halfway across, there was this giant anchor that was sitting in the middle of nowhere. I think as soon as I put a picture of that in the Deseret News, I think it was scooped up by the state in a matter of days, probably. So sometimes you write about stuff in the newspaper, it calls attention to it for good or bad. And then switching down to southeast Utah, I don't know how many of you know where Navajo Mountain is. Anyway, I thought, it'd be great to go down to Navajo Mountain and go to the top of it. So in 2004, I think it was 2003, I think that was the first time that people recognized that Lake Powell was shrinking and low. So the Deseret News sent me and a photographer and another editor who was interested down, and we were going to do a story on Lake Powell. And I think the gist of it was that I tried to say that it was half full instead of half empty, kind of give a positive spin on it. Even though when we were boating on it, you know, there were a lot of things sticking up that were hazards that, you know, weren't normally there. But anyway, I made arrangements with the Navajo chapter house president to take the Jeep road up to the top of Navajo Mountain. Because still, a lot of Navajos consider that one of their sacred mountains, and they just don't want people to go up there willy-nilly. So you have to go clear into Arizona and then come clear back up to get to this Navajo area, Navajo Mountain area. It's got to be the most non-Utah area there is, because when you get to this area, you're clearly in Utah, but virtually every vehicle has an Arizona license plate. The post office says Arizona. The area codes are Arizona, but yet you're physically in Utah. Like I say, you have to go clear down to Page and then practically swing up to get into it. So we get in this Navajo tribal office, because we had to have permits to go on, you know, their land off road. And that chapter house president was out of town. So it's like, this guy kept saying, now why do you want to go up there? And I mean, he just wasn't going to give us his permits. So I remember standing there thinking, okay, maybe I've seen one too many TV shows, but you know, sometimes Native Americans really get off on bets and things like that. So I said, okay, here's how it is. My two friends here don't believe you can see Rainbow Bridge with your naked eye from the top of Navajo Mountain. And I say you can, I want to win the bet. As soon as I said that word bet, he was signing those permits. So we got on that Jeep and went up there, and that was one of the ruggediest roads I've ever seen. I mean, there were a couple places where we had to literally back the Jeep up to make the hairpin turn. The thing, I swear, was only as wide as this table in places. And then we got almost to the top, and you could just see all over the Kaibat Plateau. You just had the greatest view of Lake Powell you could imagine. So I told my friends, well, let's just stop the Jeep and let's walk. No, we're going to drive to the top. So they just drove us out the top, and couldn't see that much or enjoy the fresh air. And so we get to the top, and there were a lot of cell towers there. And later I realized when we were on Lake Powell that you likely don't have a cell signal on the south end of Lake Powell unless you can see Navajo Mountain, because they're all up there. So the Navajos have kind of compromised their sacredness to let these towers be up there, but still, I remember seeing this one big rock. I don't think there's a picture of it in that book, but I have one at home where some Navajos had painted on a rock, no whitening in it, and put a big cross, you know, big slash through it. So they're still territorial, but we made it up there, and sure enough, that north view, you could look straight down, and with your naked eye, there was Rainbow Bridge, plain as day. And I guess when you think about it, geology-wise, if it wasn't for Navajo Mountain, Rainbow Bridge wouldn't be there, because I guess it's all the runoff from, you know, Navajo Mountain over the years that carved it anyway. So it's a fascinating mountain to me, because it's, you know, one of the Navajo sacred mountains. It was so pristine, so quiet, and except for those towers, it just seemed, you know, undisturbed. It's pretty high, 10,388 feet, but I didn't realize either, the further you go south, the higher the timberline goes up. So if you're 10,000 feet here, you're well above timberline, but that was still below timberline down there at Navajo Mountain at 10,000, almost 400 feet. Then years ago, I became fascinated with Kings Peak. I don't know how many of you have been to Kings Peak ever. Kind of a long hike. But over the years, I challenged my friends once, well, I bet we can do it in one day. We sleep in our cars at this Henry's Fork trailhead coming down from Wyoming. I bet we can hike to Kings Peak and be out in one day, go home and sleep in your own bed. And it was tough, but we did it. But you know, it was as late as like 1911, just over 100 years ago, that they didn't know about Kings Peak. I think it was Mount Emmons that all the newspaper stories said that was the tallest peak in Utah. And then even when Kings Peak became the tallest peak in, I think, about 1913 or 14, it wasn't today's Kings Peak. There's the Kings Peak today, and then there's the South Kings Peak. It's a little further south. The South Kings Peak has a lot broader base, looks a lot more stable. Look at some of the pictures in my scrapbook there, you'll see how The top of Kings Peak looked like just a pile of rocks. Forget what that movie is where they try to pile rocks on a mountain and make it higher, but
Went up the hill and came down.
yeah, that's it, yeah. But that's kind of what Kings Peak looks like. It was only when satellites came out in 1966 that they realized that that North Kings Peak was the tallest one of the two. So before that, pretty much anybody who hiked to Kings Peak just skirted by the side of the taller one, not knowing it was taller, and went to the bigger one. And then I heard rumors that Sir Edmund Hillary hiked Kings Peak in the 70s, and finally I found a report where he contracted with some outdoor gear company, and he did go through, he went as one summer, and he did hike his Kings Peak. Apparently didn't think it was that difficult.
How many feet is it?
13,528, and the South Kings Peak is 13,512. So there's not a lot of difference between the two, but there is some. And it's named for a government explorer, not for, it's the king of peaks in Utah, but it's not named for that. And speaking of height, you've all seen the Kennecott smokestack out here, right? Did you know that, strictly speaking, that's the tallest thing west of the Mississippi man-made? There's nothing taller. I guess technically there is, sometimes they put radio towers up and they have them tethered. So anything that's not tethered is the tallest thing west of Mississippi. It's 12,215 feet. So it's, let's see, the Empire State Building is a little taller than that. I guess I didn't write down what it was, but it's, even with this extras, it's not more than 100 or so feet taller than that.
Did you say 12,000 or 12,000?
1,215 feet.
That's better.
1,215.
12,000.
But anyway, I think back in 2008, I thought it'd be nice to do a story on that Kennecott smokestack. So got Kennecott to give me a tour and go down there. And inside the smokestack, they have a tethered kind of little cage. And they said, oh yeah, if this is working today, we'd throw you in this cage and we'd hoist you up to the top of it on the inside. But they said, we don't really need this tall of a tower today because with today's better scrubbing, anti-pollution stuff, that's overkill. It would cost so much to take that thing down that we just leave it up. So anyway, I started looking at rankings worldwide just to see where that ranked, because that seemed pretty high to me. And Kennecott said, well, where are you getting 1,215 feet? We only have it at like, I think it was 1,195 feet or something. Well, where are you getting? Well, I said years ago I took something, they told me it was 1,215 feet tall. And so finally they checked with some old timers and they forgot there's a big lip on the top of it, and they weren't counting that originally. Because so many people retired that just got lost, that if you're that tall, but that extra 20 feet worldwide means it's a lot more better ranking among the world's tallest structures than it would be otherwise. So that 20 feet makes a lot of difference.
So how does it rank?
I guess I didn't write down here what it is. I think it's the world's third tallest smokestack.
Third.
Yeah, but I mean, there's some other things, there's a lot of buildings that are far taller than that. In fact, somewhere in the Middle East, I think they're building one that is going to eclipse what even they have now, and it's going to be like a half-mile high. So. But anyway, speaking of Kennecott, there's also behind Kennecott, there's the Ochre Mountains there, and that's an Indian name that, as far as I can tell, means Shining Mountain. And years ago, I finally was able to convince KSL to let me go up to the top of those towers up there, because literally every FM radio station has their towers in the Ochre Mountains because they reach the Wasatch Front better. Even though the Wasatch is taller, strategically that's a lot better. So you have, like, I think 6 or 8 FM radio stations right there on KSL's tower on Farnsworth Peak. And there's Little Farnsworth Peak, I think that's where Fox 13 has their TV antenna, and then you go further west, south, there's Mount Vision, that's where Channel 4 is, and so they're all there in the Ochre somewhere. But they used to have a tram in the backside. Have you guys ever heard of that? There was a tramway that went up from the Tooele side. I understand that put a lot of amusement rides today to shame because that was pretty shaky. And I guess if you know where to look, there's huge blocks going up the mountain where they anchored, you know, the poles and stuff too. But it's been gone lots of years now. I think now they helicopter you up there, but you know, they had to have a way to get up there and keep the things going. So I think they keep that road open through the canyon there as much as they can. And then if you switch to Ensign Peak, how many of you have been to top Ensign Peak? Yeah, I didn't realize what a strategic mountain that was. That's probably the first climb the pioneers ever did. You know, outside of getting here was, you know, going up there and kind of looking the lay of the land there. And I guess Joseph Smith had some visions of how Salt Lake, you know, looked and whatever. And that's kind of, I think, what Brigham Young went by too, as to know that this was the place. But Ensign Peak has a really interesting history. I mean, I didn't realize back in the 1910 era they wanted to put a cross up there. When I say they, I mean Salt Lake City and the LDS Church both. They wanted to put a huge cross on Ensign Peak and show that, hey, Mormons are Christians. I mean, I always assumed that from day one that, you know, the LDS Church didn't like crosses because they were more Catholics, right? So one day back in the 1990s, I was looking at some of my mother's old pictures. She grew up in Grace, Idaho, here in southeast Idaho. So I'm looking at a picture of her family, and I see that my aunt, the youngest daughter in this family, has a big cross on her neck. I go, what? So this is like 1947, 1948. So it looked like to me until the early 50s, the cross wasn't really discouraged by the LDS Church much at all, if anything. But I've even heard historically that Joseph Smith may have never even seen a cross on a church because, you know, Catholicism wasn't established in the areas that he was in. He was pretty much Protestant everywhere, and they avoided the cross initially because they didn't want to be confused with Catholics. So he may have never seen a cross himself, but it seemed like there were just a lot of people that didn't want that cross on Ensign Peak. And so eventually they just gave it up. And over the years, I think the Ku Klux Klan held things up there and burned their symbols up there temporarily. And I mean, if you go back far enough, you know, before the endowment house, the base of Ensign Peak was an outdoor temple. I mean, they literally did endowments for the LDS temple rights right there in the open on Ensign Peak. I don't think it was really the peak, but it was down more the base of the peak, you know, where it was flatter and whatever. And as soon as the endowment house came, they didn't need that because they had a place to go. But for the endowment house, I found reports that seemed to indicate that's what happened. No, but you can't speculate too much because when I did a story on Ensign Peak back in the early 90s, it was the first time I'd had anything in the church news section of the Deseret News. Well, I hadn't realized that the correlation committee comes over and reads every word of that. They don't read every word of the newspaper, but for the church news section, they scrutinize every word. And so there were a couple of things in there that they took out just because they didn't want any kind of opinion in there, conjecture, but I kind of called it the church's Mount Sinai. They left that in there. I thought that was a pretty good parallel. Now, see, I talked about Farnsworth Peak because that's interesting. So I don't know if you ever noticed in Davis County, there's some weird kind of city situations. South Weber is actually in Davis County, not Weber County. So for years that kind of perplexed me, and I thought, well, it must be because the Weber River's right there, so they named it after the Weber River. Well, no. I didn't realize that in 1855, they moved the Davis County boundary south for an interesting reason, an ecclesiastical disagreement, so to speak. So Lawrence Farr, who was a prominent person in Ogden history, the mayor and everything, he was pretty much the stake president for Weber County for decades. And he and the South Weber bishop, Thomas Kington, didn't get along. And all this Bishop Kington wanted to do was get away from Lawrence Farr's jurisdiction. So in 1855, he had the territorial legislature to move the county line 1 mile north. For no other reason than he asked, I guess. And that meant he was under the, Davis County stake president and not a Weber County stake president. And see, the ripple effect of that is that I grew up in Hooper in Weber County, and if you look at Hooper now, 1/3 of it's in Davis County. Because when they moved that line north, that went clear to the lake. So a mile or so of Hooper is in Davis County, and one day probably West Point will annex that because nobody in Weber County can claim it because it's a different county. So that bishop was lucky. That's how he got free of a stake president he didn't care for, I guess. And how many of you have heard of the Bear Lake Monster? Nobody's seen it, right? So when all these newspapers came on easy access because of being digitally online, the University of Utah has a portal, and they're scanning more and more weekly and daily newspapers in. So you can go to this website and you can type in a family name, and you can type in a place name, and 90+% of the time you'll get everything that's under there coming up. Whereas in the old days you had to knock yourself silly looking at microfilm. How many have gazed at microfilm for hours? That's really tough on the eyes, and you gotta spin the wheel, and you gotta look.
This is University of Utah portal?
Yeah, they use grant money. I forget what the actual portal is, but if you search for Utah and digital newspapers, you'll find it, and then you can do a bookmark for it. But they've digitized all the newspapers. Well, not all of them, but a lot of them now. They're still doing more all the time. And it's just a great way to find any crazy things you've heard about your family, or accidents, something that you think might have made the newspaper, a weekly newspaper, one of the big newspapers here in Salt Lake. But be warned, though, you'll spend tons of time on it, and you'll find a lot more than you bargained for. Because I find the best stuff when I'm looking for something else. I go, wow, look, here's something I wasn't planning on. So anyway, back to the Bear Lake Monster. I quickly realized from the very first report of the Bear Lake Monster, that's not correct. It was Bear Lake Monsters. I think he said there were 10 of them, 10 different monsters in that first report. So you got to make it in the plural. So I mean, that went on for 20 or 30 years, and then it kind of died out, and then it had a resurgence again in the 1910 and 20s, and then it kind of died out again. I think the last one I could find was 2002. There was a businessman in Bear Lake Valley that claimed he saw the Bear Lake Monster. When the Bear Lake's full, it's 210 feet deep is the deepest point on the east side. I forget what Utah Resort is over there, State Park, but that's the deepest point, 210 feet over there. But it seemed like in the mid-1970s, a Utah Fish and Game official had the best explanation for the Bear Lake Monster that I've ever found, though. Is he saw one night in the twilight that if the elk came down from the mountain, they would often swim as a chain in the lake. And he said if you saw it in low light, you would think it was a serpent, the way they kind of winded around and they just tugged each other together like one, an unbroken chain. So probably there's not too many elk around there now, but that's the most plausible explanation I can have. But there's dozens of stories you can read where there's some that are just totally fictionalized. You can read them and just tell that they're just writing fiction. I mean, they're just far out even for their day, but they're entertaining. And then, just because Bear Lake had a monster, the Great Salt Lake had to have one, right? So in 1875, there were a bunch of salt extraction employees on the North Arm, not too far from where the spiral jetty is now. And they claimed there was a huge mass of hide and fin that chased them out of the lake. And so they refused to leave the rocky hiding place they had overnight. They'd come out till morning and then report it to their bosses, who all laughed at them. But apparently the lake was only 3 feet deep or less in that whole area, so you can see where they got laughed at. And then later, I think Utah Lake has their own account of a monster or two in it too, so they all seem to catch on. And then, how Bryce Canyon isn't really a canyon? Well, I didn't think much of it, but when I was doing some research on something else a couple of months ago, I realized in 1920, the Salt Lake newspapers sponsored a Rename Bryce Canyon contest. We can't call it Bryce Canyon. It's not really a canyon. So quit calling it a canyon. So they had like this month-long contest, and then they got such a revolt from Garfield County people that they quietly dropped it. So I guess we'll never know what some of the names submitted to replace it were, because that pretty much set it in stone. That's what it's always been called, and that's what it's going to stay. So nobody won the contest, apparently. I'm trying to remember what, I think the grand prize was, you got some catered trip through all the southern Utah parks, but as far as I can tell, they never gave the prize. Then if you go out of our state, Disneyland, you've been to the Haunted Mansion there? They've got that hearse there, and some people still swear that's Brigham Young's hearse, but Brigham Young didn't have a hearse. They carried him on a slab, down the street, from place to place, so no hearse was used. And so I guess the jury's out on whether or not that hearse was ever from Utah, because its actual papers of authenticity have been lost. But I did find out that Utah does kind of have a connection to that Haunted Mansion, because when it opened, I guess Disneyland wanted a bunch of young people to come through there and say how great it was. So Kurt Russell was in his heyday with Disney movies then, and he was also great friends with the Osmonds. So for the opening week, they gave Kurt Russell and all the Osmond brothers and family a big personal tour through the Haunted Mansion, and they took pictures and everything, and so there is kind of a Utah connection there, I guess. And then there's always been hoaxes in the newspaper over the years, and not just on April Fool. I think it was last month I found probably the best April Fool newspaper prank I've ever seen, though. The Salt Lake Herald on April 1st, 1907, so just barely over 110, almost 110 years ago today. They had this big headline about big gold mine found in the mountains east of Salt Lake. And I mean, you start reading this, and it reads pretty factually, how big this cavern was and how much gold was in there, and who found it, and it just goes on and on. I'm reading this thinking, what the heck? And finally, I happen to look at the date, see April 1, and go, oh, okay, that explains it. It's just a hoax, right? But it was pretty well written, and it caught me off guard even 110 years later. There was an April Fool, well, it wasn't April Fool playing, but down in St. George, back in probably the early 1920s, there was a big group of Utah officials were going down and touring the St. George area. You know, if you go around the backside of St. George over to Vail and Snow Canyon, you know, it's a lot more open landscape. But there's also some old volcano left, right? Well, a bunch of teenagers or maybe even young men in their 20s decided, well, we're going to play a prank on these officials. So they, in advance, put a bunch of tires inside one of those volcanoes and some dynamite, and they waited until that motorcade came right down there by, and then they set it all off. And I guess they even spooked everybody enough that they sent word to Salt Lake to send a geologist down and see what the heck was going on before, shortly after, they realized it was a prank. Kind of everybody by surprise there anyway. And I was down in St. George, I think this was probably 7, 8 years ago, and you know, I did some research one time about where the St. George name came from and all that stuff, but one of my sons says, so Dad, how come the temple's here, the tabernacle's way over there? Shouldn't they be right by each other? And I thought, yeah, you know, and Salt Lake, they're close. You know, everywhere else they seem to be right by each other, right? So as I'm thinking about this question, of course he's looking it up online himself. He goes, oh, here it is. Yeah, it was so hard to build, I can't remember which one came first, the temple or the tabernacle, but whichever one came first, it was so hard to build. I think it was the temple, because that was the first temple in the church, wasn't it? That there was a swamp there. I mean, if some of these temple sites were dedicated by some of these Nephite prophets, they loved swampy ground, or at least it became swampy ground. Because after it was so hard to drain that swamp and build that temple, apparently those people down in St. George went to Ridium and said, hey, we don't want to go through that again. Can we build the tabernacle somewhere where it's more stable ground? So that's why they're far apart. It's because of the ground. They didn't want to deal with that. I never thought of that before. And then for years, because you know I have that family up in southeast Idaho, we'd always go through Sardine Canyon, or so it was called. And I thought, why is this Sardine Canyon? It's not narrow. I don't see any streams. Where the heck did this name come from? So I did as much research as I could, and it's still impossible to decide which one is which, or which one, or maybe a combination of both. But there's pretty good evidence that they did have sardine cans back in the late 1840s and early 1850s. And that apparently some pioneers on their way to Cache Valley in the early 1850s, I think, when they settled up there, ate a sardine lunch and just left their cans there. And then pioneers came along and saw it and go, oh yeah, we're gonna call this Sardine Canyon, and the name caught on. But then also, the road doesn't go where it used to go. I mean, technically, it's Box Elder Canyon from Brigham City to Manaway. Then from Manaway to Sardine Summit, I think it's Dry Canyon they call it, because again, there's no water there. And then from the top of Sardine Summit into Cache County, that's Wellsville Canyon. So the real Sardine Canyons are off to the kind of what would be the northeast, because the road actually took 2 different variations before you get the variation we have today. And so one of them did have a little narrow canyon, still not real narrow, but there were streams there. And there were these little sardine-sized fish, you know, that they would see in the summer in those streams. So it had to be one of those 2 or both that created that name, Sardine Canyon. And then, I always grew up knowing the 1920s, they call them the Roaring Twenties, kind of a crazy thing, but I didn't know how crazy it really was, because in the 1920s, they didn't just outlaw alcohol, they also created these giant wildlife preserves that really didn't survive to this day. So they did quite a few out of state, but in Utah, the first one was in Ogden. They call it the Mount Ogden Game Sanctuary. And from Weber Canyon clear to Ben Lomond Peak, you could not hunt, you could not carry a gun in those mountains, clear over to the Huntsville side. So for like 10 or 12 years, that was a game preserve. And so, as I read about those mountains during that time, they had deer populations that got out of control. They tried to poison some of the coyotes and undesirable animals because they couldn't seem to keep them in control, and just kind of threw nature out of balance. But I didn't realize in that same time, they tried one over here, I think by the Twin Peaks area. They tried another game, same concept of a preserve where you can't hunt or carry a gun or anything, had signs up and hefty fines. So they kind of, I think they had another one in Salt Lake somewhere too along the foothills, but they didn't last more than 10 or so years because eventually I guess they decided, well, let's just have a set deer hunt every year and make you get a permit. That kept the populations in control, but they did experiment with those sanctuaries. Then back to St. George. You know that St. George isn't the lowest highest place in Utah, right? Because some years ago I decided, okay, I now have a GPS. How hard would it be to find the lowest point in Utah? Okay, I've been to Kings Peak, the highest. Where's the lowest, right? So I knew it was in Beaver Dam Wash. I don't know if you know where Beaver Dam Wash is. It eventually goes into, not Mesquite, what's that town before Mesquite in Nevada? I forget it.
Beaver Dam?
Yeah, Beaver Dam, yeah. That's where it comes down there. It just goes downhill, but I knew somewhere right by the border there of Utah and Arizona that had to be the lowest spot in Utah. So me and a couple of friends went in there stupidly in early June, and we planned this trip, and it happened to be a 106-degree day. Not a great day, extra warm for even them. But yeah, we found that it's about, I think it was 2,168 feet is what my GPS said was the lowest point. But again, that's in flux because where that's a wash, who knows that some flood hasn't come through and raised that or lowered that a little. But yeah, it's right by this fence line. So you cross that fence line, you're in Arizona, and the other side was Utah. But it's right in that Beaver Dam Wash area. See, St. George is about 2,800 feet. So this is what, 622 feet lower. So it is warmer and it is lower. Then how many of you know where Ben Lomond Peak is? Some of us. A prominent peak as you're in Ogden looking straight north. Anyway, the man who started Paramount Pictures, he grew up in the north part of Ogden. And when he was in California going to start his film company, Paramount, the two histories that are written on him say that he scribbled on a napkin, you know, his memories of Ben Lomond Peak, because it does look pretty looming when you're in the north part of Ogden City. So I mean, Hollywood exaggerates, right? When you see a movie now, you see Paramount, you see this huge mountain sticking up. I mean, that's not Ben Lomond, but it was inspired by Ben Lomond, because that was his childhood, you know, memories. And so that's why he used the mountain as of that. So then I assume most of you are LDS here, right? So I guess they're redoing the Jordan River Temple right now. Is that right? It's closed. You know, that's one of the most unique temples in the church, or at least it was, because it's the only one that was never built by church money. You guys heard the story on that? So when they were going to redo the Ogden Temple, I got drafted into helping to write. See, I didn't know every time the church builds a new temple or rebuilds a new temple enough that it has to be rededicated, they do a new history book. But it's not one that the average church member can get it. It's kind of an inner circle book. So if you're part of a committee, if you're in that temple, you might see it in the library, but they probably only print 500-600 copies of it. So anyway, they told me, you know, we wanted you to help write this book on the Ogden temple history. So naturally, that's intertwined with the Provo temple because they were built at the same time. And Fred Baker, he was the head of church facilities for years. He happened to, luckily for me, be in my wife's neighborhood, and his former bishop and stake president. So I sat down in his last couple of years because he died about 2 years ago, but was able to tape record some of his memories of temples being built during his administration. Even back when he was just an assistant, back when the building committee today started in '65. To make a long story short, the church has a stringent policy where you can donate land to them, but you can't put any strings attached to it. Like, oh, you've got to do this here or that here or something. They just 99% of the time refuse to have any strings attached to what they're going to do to it. But you donate it. So anyway, Fred Baker told me, yeah, these people out in Jordan River, you know, they want a temple, and they want it bad. And they save money, and they have land. And so he said it was a miraculous thing over a period of months that he kept being pestered to tell the brethren, hey, you need to go out and visit this site, because these members out here have a vision, and they have money to back it up. So finally, after so many months, when Fred Baker said finally he'd given up that anything would happen of it, the brethren, First Presidency called him and says, hey, can you schedule that tour you were telling us about months ago? We want to go out and look at this land. They went out there. They said, yeah, we're going to build a temple there. And they had a committee organized out there, and they said, well, how much is that temple going to cost? Because we want to pay for it. Well, I don't know. I mean, until you do drawings and, you know, it's a plan, you don't know. But they contributed, I forget the exact number, I'd have to look at my book at home, but it was somewhere between 10 and $20 million that these people out there came up with, plus the land. And so that's the only temple in the church that was built with no direct church money from tithing or any other fund, but from the members out there. There was so much left over that it went for 10, 15 years in maintenance beyond. So now if they're going to redo it, I guess it's going to probably going to do that, because it's obviously church money now that's probably making that up. But when I was looking at the church archives for information on the Ogden Temple, I found some other interesting things I didn't know about. Have you ever heard of the temple ship idea? Any of you? So back in the late 60s, so this building committee that Fred Baker was on started in 1965. Before 1965, the church did really makeshift building of chapels, so to speak. So like if you were in Burley, Idaho, and you wanted a chapel, you called up church headquarters and said, hey, we want a chapel. Church headquarters would say, hey, we'll send you $5,000. You've got to come up with the rest of the money, and usually even practically design it and build it yourself. So they didn't have, you know, set plans for chapels and all that stuff. It just kind of followed tradition. So a lot of them looked alike in certain areas, like here, where there were a lot of them, but it was President Tanner, and Eldon Tanner, that thought, you know, we've got to have consistency. We've got to have a formal church building committee. So he drafted Fred Baker, who was working for Commercial Security Bank in Ogden, and he drafted, trying to think, Emil Fetzer, an architect, and then, trying to think of the third name here, it's eluding me. Agarth, I'm trying to think of his first name.
Robert?
No. No, but anyway, one of the Garth men, those were the three members of this original committee. And so, and Eldon Tanner kind of put them unofficially in place, and then he said, you've got to convince the brethren that you're needed. So I scheduled this solemn assembly meeting in the Salt Lake Temple and you can present your case of why we need a building committee. So they went in there and Brother Garf said his piece, and apparently the brother didn't seem swayed. And then finally, he said, Brother Baker, your turn. And Brother Baker said, oh, I don't know. All of a sudden the scripture came in my mind, the New Testament, that said basically, how can you build a tower if you don't know how much it's going to cost? So Brother Baker read that scripture, and he saw that all the brothers started whispering among themselves. He said that one scripture turned the tide. I thought, yep, you're right. The church is big enough, we need a building committee. We need things structured, planned, and better set in stone. So that set it off anyway. So anyway, in 1967, they didn't have any temples in the church, but they wanted to give the temple blessings to as many people as they could. So these 3-member committee started looking at a world map, and they realized that outside of the United States, the majority of church members lived by oceans, by ports. So what if we were to get an ocean liner, retrofit it, have a temple in the middle, people could live in some of the rooms on the outside, you could be self-contained, you could go around the world, serve all the needs. So they actually had a cost, $2 million something to buy this ship, a plan to retrofit it. So they went to David McKay initially, and he gave them an okay to proceed, to a final proposal. Then David McKay had passed away, and so it was Joseph Fielding Smith in charge. And Joseph Fielding Smith apparently looked at this proposal and he goes, your figures look good, your idea looks good, but I'm troubled by one thing. What stake is that temple going to be in? You have to have a stake anchored to a temple. If you have a ship just going all over the world, there's no boundary for it. I just can't see a precedent in the scriptures that'll supersede that. So he turned it down because of the boundary issue. But they had the ship ready to buy and retrofit, and he said we visioned painting it white. USS Celestial is what they joked the name of it could be. That never happened, but it could have happened. A lot of these old newspaper things, if you search them yourself, that's what you'll see is things that almost happened like that aren't in the history books. But they're still intriguing because it just, is the what if that would have happened. So anyway, that's pretty much what I have. Any questions, comments?
One of the people that was involved in that ship temple said that the reason that the brethren turned it down is because it would be on water, and Satan rules the waters.
Yeah, that could be another reason, but maybe it was the two reasons together. But they're big on boundaries. In fact, they just about 6 or 7 years ago they opened the new Desert Industries in it's actually in Harrisville, but it replaced the original one in Ogden that was there. And I happened to have to go to cover the grand opening of that Desert Industries, and they have Asian bishops whenever they do a project like that oversees it. Well, this Asian bishop was from Syracuse, and I go, wait a minute, why are you from Syracuse? I just drove here from Lane. It was like 25 miles out to this place. And he said, well, believe it or not, Syracuse is in the boundaries of this DI here. I go, what? Just a mile to the north is Layton, and they have a DI? That's crazy. So I called up the head of Desert Industries with the church, and he said, oh yeah, that's right, I don't like it, but it's a boundary issue. And I can't change it unless this certain priesthood committee convenes, and I can't get him to convene. So he says, until they convened, I can't change that boundary. So boundaries, I guess, are more inflexible than I thought. I guess unless you can move the county line like that one guy did, right? So any questions about any of this? Or there's just amazing things you can find about your own family in these digital newspapers, because seriously, you can type in a family name and...
How do you search those newspapers? By just a find? Like find a name and then...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, if you search on Google, because I don't remember the exact website, but If you go to Google and type in Utah and digital newspapers, you'll get the main site to come up. Then you can either search every newspaper that's been scanned in, or you can click on so many weekly newspapers that I've never heard of, or individual paper. When the Salt Lake Tribune's in there, the Deseret News, Salt Lake Herald, Daily Herald. I mean, not everything's there, but they're getting probably 67% of it in the state is there.
And there's a site that you can purchase, as a membership that has almost every one that's
Right.
needing them.
I mean, this one's free. If you don't want to
Yeah.
spend any money, this one's free.
That one has a lot.
Yeah, he's talking about one that has a lot more.
You know,
So how far back did it go?
Well, I mean, it goes back to 1850 when the Deseret News started, and then some weekly newspapers started 1870s, 1880s. Yes,
I did that one time, and it talks about the general conferences used to be a lot more days.
right.
It used to be like Thursday, Fridays, Saturday, and Sunday.
Sunday, right, yeah,
Yeah, and 4 times a year.
yeah.
Also online now is from the church itself, a website called Journal of Church History, which is a day-by-day account written by church historians, and that goes back to the first days of Salt Lake City.
And it's their opinion, or it's like a journal entry of?
It's a journal written by church historians.
Of the happenings of the day.
Yeah, it's all handwritten,
Right.
up until about 1880. Then it's a typed account, has some newspaper articles from the Deseret News and other
And
papers.
do we have access to that one?
Yeah, it's free.
It is?
Just put in Journal of Church History.
Okay.
Yeah, the one caution with that though is, and I'm as much to blame for this as anybody, but a lot of times when you're reading 100, 200 years ago, it's so easy to judge that segment of history by today's standards. So laws weren't the same, a lot of things were different. You pretty much have to, you hear the thing, walk in somebody's shoes. Well, kind of have to give some of these people a grain of salt, because some of the things they did seem kind of silly, but some of it was just what they, did back in those times. And then, you've heard of the Journal of Discourses. Sometimes they make that up to be this inaccurate account of things. All it really is the Deseret News from 1850 something to the 1880s, republished so the saints in Britain could have them. So it's pretty much the Deseret News sermons, not the whole Deseret News. But back then, they didn't have reporters, they had scribes. So like this John D. Watt was one of their main ones. He hand wrote down everything that speakers said. But also, things were different back then because you had multiple speakers at the same time, because the tabernacle by the 1900s was filled to brim and overflowing. So they would have overfull speakers on Temple Square giving separate sermons and in the assembly hall. So simultaneously you could have 2 or 3 sermons going on. And they weren't really correlated back then either. So you never know what you're going to hear, because one line they might be talking about some farming problem, the next line they're talking about, a spiritual thing, and they just jump back and forth. But I compared a lot of the Journal of Discourse entries with the original Deseret News microfilm, and they're 99% accurate. Once in a while, I found in the newspapers where Brigham Young would come back and say, yeah, I was kind of misquoted last week in my sermon, or I didn't make this clear, and then he would give a paragraph or 2 clarification. That didn't make it in to the Journal of Discourses, those little clarifications.
Well, we want to thank Lynn for being here with us tonight. I don't know about the rest of you, but I felt this has been a very interesting session for us, and I wish there was more time, because I'm sure that he just barely scratched the surface. As he was talking about different places, I thought about salt air, and he didn't even mention salt air, and I remember my parents talking, going up there, swimming all the time, and going out to that lake, and literally there, they told me that there was a roller coaster car that left the track and went into the lake. And, but I don't, that was just from my parents, and I know they wouldn't lie to me. So, well, thank you very much for being here with us. Dale, would you like to give a closing prayer for us, please?
Do you want to mention that paper that you have?
I think I did mention it. The flyers are available here on the annual convention for the Sons of Utah Pioneers. And I know my wife and I went a few years ago, and that was really a fascinating thing to go to. They have very well organized and opportunities to go on special tours and everything else. So if you'd be interested, there's a stack of the flyers here that you can pick up. Thank you very much for being here, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. I told my dear wife, and I was telling my wife, in our ward, our bishop is changing next Sunday. And the old bishop invited the wives and the people that worked with him, the executive secretaries and assistants and so forth, to a dinner tonight. And I chose to be here with you, brethren and sisters, and I appreciate that very much. So, Dale?
Our Father in heaven, we are grateful this evening to be able to share food, memories, information. Grateful, Father, for the Sons of the Utah Pioneers, and those of us that have ancestors in that great group. We're thankful for what they did in bringing things for us at this time in our lives. Now help us that we can feel good tonight, that we can travel home safely. We give thee thanks for our speaker, grateful for the food. And we say this humbly in the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Amen. One thing I wanted to mention, Ivan Einsinger is having another challenge with his treatments, and he had an option of taking the medication that he's taking now, which makes him feel really crappy, or else he could take another one which would destroy his kidneys and put him on dialysis. So he opted for this feeling crumb. Is that about right? So if you leave him in your prayers, he'd appreciate it, I know. And did we introduce you?
Kind of.
Okay.
Yeah, my name.
Taylor, yeah,
Yeah.
okay. Thank you, and if you want to leave something for the tip on the table, that's fine. Also, a reminder that those who would like to make a donation for the scholarship, please